We've been fortunate to have some great detectives appear on I Catch Killers over the years, and today's guest is right up there with the best of them. He's a recently retired former Queensland cop whose reputation as a law enforcement officer is acknowledged around the world. His area of expertise is that of child exploitation. It's one of the most difficult areas in policing. If a person's career is defined by the legacy and the difference they make, today's guest has a lot to be proud of. Today we're talking to Jon Rouse, a 39-year veteran of the Queensland Police Force, and I'm looking forward to it. The I Catch Killers podcast was a fresh start for me, as I left policing behind and started a new life. Over the years, we've laughed together, cried, and shared some powerful moments. Welcome to I Catch Killers. Jon Rouse, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And like I said, I'm just sorry it took a while to pull it together.
Well, I get a sense of how busy you are and, an extraordinary career that you've had. And, I normally do this at the end of the podcast, but I'll say it up front. Congratulations on your career, because I've had a look in prepping for this podcast, and you really have made a difference. Must be something you're very proud of.
It's not something I ever kind of stopped and thought about really. But in that time, all those achievements don't come down to one person. They come down to the team of people that I had the pleasure of working with for so long. So hopefully I can just keep making a difference, but outside of law enforcement now.
Yeah. Well, when did you retire? It's only relatively recent.
Yeah, the actual official date was June last year, 2023. But I commenced long service leave in December of 2022. So I was kind of offline for about 6 months before the final march out of police headquarters with the bagpipes.
Very good. And 39 years or 39 and a half years you had in the Queensland Police Force?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, couldn't quite make 40 due to my age.
Yeah, you were talking about that off mic, that in Queensland, and we don't have it in New South Wales, but there's a mandatory retirement age.
Yes, unfortunately, apparently when you turn 60, you're unemployable and too old to be a cop anymore, which is a really interesting act of discrimination. Most people would probably think that 39 and a half years in frontline investigative work is enough. But I think my point has always been I would have liked to have been given the choice,
Yeah, and I think if you are a passionate police officer, or any career for that matter, when your time's up. You wouldn't hang around if you didn't think you could still contribute. So having that mandatory one, I think, one rule for all is probably not the best. And the experience that you lose, I don't know about you, but I was learning something every day I came to work in the police.
Yeah.
And I had 34 years in the police, and still each day I turned up, I was learning something new, and that knowledge base that you just keep building up. And it's
it's particularly working in a technology facilitated crimes area, which I was. Every single day there's a new technical innovation, and there's knowledge and experience, but there's also connectivity and networks that form over that period of time that kind of walked out the door as well. So, it's an interesting policy decision in an era where it's very hard to recruit into law enforcement anyway.
Yeah,
So,
I want to talk about that, and we'll cover that a little bit further, because I know in New South Wales, and I think it's across the country, that we're having trouble. All the different law enforcement agencies recruiting staff. Just want to talk about your area of specialisation, protecting of children. The nature of that work, child protection. What makes that different from other type of investigations you do as a police officer?
good question. Look, when I first started working in child protection, which was 1996, I was working in a very broad area of child protection, which was emotional and physical. It had sexual abuse of children as well, neglect. It was very broad, and crimes against children take a multitude of forms. And I've got to say that when I first started working in it, I found it incredibly hard, because you just didn't feel like you're ever going to have any kind of strategic impact on those things happening to kids.
Yeah.
It was every single day a new case, and that continues to today. I think where it changed for me particularly was the by utilizing technology and uh, innovating some investigative strategies, we were able to get on the front foot and not just be able to proactively stop sexual abuse of kids, but stop it in its tracks while it was happening, so that 2 or 3 year old or 4 year old kids have a chance of growing up without hopefully ever even knowing really what happened to them.
Yeah,
So I think that's the difference, But drugs, break and enter, fraud, homicide, the crimes happened. There's damage. Hopefully, law enforcement bring justice to the victims of that crime. But you're not having any strategic impact on stopping those things happening into the future. And I think that was the difference, and that's what kept me going to work every single day.
well, it's very much apparent throughout your career. You were fairly innovative in the way that you looked at policing and investigation in that world, and bringing it into a proactive rather than reactive, and breaking that down for listeners. Homicide investigation is very much reactive. The homicide has happened. We get called in and we investigate the crime. Hopefully, find out who was responsible for it. Proactive policing is about prevention of the crime, and that's something that you really championed in your time as in child protection. And yeah, you look at it; it's not hard, is it? Not hard to think where the benefits lie by that, preventing a crime rather than allowing it to happen and then catching the perpetrator. But you've still got all these damaged victims.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And a lot of the things that compelled me to really reshape the way that we were dealing with the investigations was seeing the damage that was done. Talking to people. So Argos, for example, when it first started, was dealing with historical sexual abuse. You're dealing with people who their lives have been destroyed
Yeah.
by this. So you flip that on its head and try to stop it as young as you possibly can, then they have a chance at moving past it, growing up, the threat's been removed from their environment, they have a chance at hopefully a normal life.
Yeah, there has to be some benefit to it. Let's wind it back a bit and find out why you joined the police. Now, in my research, it apparently could have gone a different way. You could have been a rock star traveling the country, playing the keyboards.
don't don't know if I ever would have reached the elevation of rock star, but yeah, look, I was a little torn about which way I wanted to go. So, like, I started playing in a band at school. We were playing at school dances in year 10, year 11, year 12. And, I've had my first thoughts about being a police officer in year 11 and year 12. But I thought I'd give the musical thing a bit of a go. And I joined the Commonwealth Bank when they had a branch at Paddington here in Queensland. I was different roles within the bank, including being a teller. But that helped finance the purchase of some musical equipment. Synthesizers weren't cheap things for me being a keyboard player, so I explored that path for quite a while. And we were touring as a support act for the Eurogliders and Pseudo Echo and Goanna and Party Boys, Kevin Borich Express, all of these really fantastic
you're rattling
bands.
off some names there. You're in the mix.
We were like the band Neon Park, which I was in back in the early '80s. Really phenomenal musicians. It was great fun, but if you, on the flip side, you're making about 75 cents a night.
Yeah.
So you're doing it because you love being a musician and you love playing live and all that sort of thing. So during that pathway of being an aspiring rock star, I left the bank and I joined the police academy, and I was kind of carrying both those for a little while, and then it was just impossible with shift work and stuff like that.
That would have been an interesting mix of cultures too. You joined the police in '84, and the rock scene in '84 is a little bit different from the police scene in '84. So it would have been an interesting juggling act.
Yeah, look, it was because, as a support act, you were responsible. This is probably a little known fact to lots of people, but the support act was responsible for lugging in and lugging out and helping pack down the main act's gear.
Yeah.
Right. So you had to turn up early, set their gear up, set your gear up, pack your gear down, wait around till they finish playing, and then pull their gear down too. So you were interacting with a lot of road crew, and I love roadies.
Yep.
They're great people, but they're also a little bit on the some of them anyway are on the other side of the fence when it comes to law enforcement. So
Yeah.
once a lot of them got to know that I was at the police academy, it kind of it caused a few
I can
uncomfortable
imagine.
positions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A real clash of cultures there. There's another byline to the story of you joining the police that's quite interesting, and it does give a good perspective, I think, throughout your career. But you happen to find yourself, when you were working in the bank, as a victim of an armed robbery.
Yeah. So the Commonwealth Bank of Paddington got held up a couple of times while I was there. Uh, the bikie bandits, as they were known back there, decided to hold up the bank. And yeah, I just remember these guys coming in. I was actually not telling it at that stage. I was actually just out on the general floor at inquiries. And, everybody, all the staff hit the floor. And I remember the funny thing is that I kind of acutely remember making a concerted effort to listen to his voice, watch everything he was doing, look at his clothing, taking detail of everything that he was wearing. As soon as they'd got the money and they were exiting the bank, I jumped over the counter. I followed this guy out onto the corner, and I was walking behind him down the street as the pickup car came around the corner and cruised beside me, which was a kind of a bit of a wake up moment.
Yeah.
And then they disappeared. And then, not too long after that, the armed robbery squad turned up, and a whole bunch of guys that looked like Sipowicz.
That would have been the time, the era.
And it was really, it's funny to reflect on. And they turned up with their own typewriters, and they were smoking and typing away, taking everyone's statements. So that was that was perhaps a pivotal moment. I mean, I had made a pretty clear decision that I wanted to join law enforcement, but that may well have influenced me, pushed me over the edge.
Little thing like that. What about
Yeah.
from being the victim of a crime? Because and back in that time, armed robberies were a regular thing. You're working in a bank or working at the local detective's office. Invariably, come the end of business on a Friday afternoon, there'd be some banks getting knocked off. The impact it has on victims, and it can be long lasting. It can be dramatic, to have a gun pointed at you and lose control and thinking you're going to die.
Yeah.
Did you process what happened to you as a victim in that scenario?
It's funny. It affected different people in the branch in different ways. I know some of them, the teller in particular, he never came back to work. They moved him into head office. It really did traumatize him quite horrendously.
Yep.
The branch closed for the day. They brought in other staff to man the branch. It didn't really affect me. I mean, hindsight, I don't recall it really having a huge impact on me in any way, other than that I was angry that they could do this to people.
Yep.
But I saw how it impacted on everyone else in the branch.
Yeah. That is the nature of crime quite often, Bud, isn't it? The different people react in different ways to the trauma associated with it, and just how you process it. Another interesting thing with your career in policing was that both your parents were in the Navy, and so serving as a public servant, whether that's to serve your country or to serve a state, was something that wasn't foreign to you, and did that help with the fit of being a police officer? Like it was a part of a duty, sounds probably over the top, but to be a public servant was something that was worthwhile?
Yeah, look, my mum and dad were, particularly as a role model, my dad were very big influences on me. And, I was dragged around naval bases around the world. I was born in New Guinea at the naval base on Manus Island. Then we moved to Jervis Bay, to the naval base there. Then Dad got posted to Singapore, and we went to Singapore, and then back down to Crib Point at Frankston in Victoria. So I was moved around. I think I did like 10 schools or something like that, which, as you'd understand, has a big impact on you too, with breaking into peer groups. Crib Point, Frankston in general, is a pretty tough area of Victoria. Day one, so picture this: two young boys, my brother and I. He's 18 months older than me. I was in year 2, and he was in year 4, I think.
Yep.
Day one, we turned back up in Australia from Singapore, where we went to a British school, so we had plumb British accents. And day one, the two school bullies, 3 o'clock on the oval, fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Welcome to Australia. Uh,
Well,
so there's lots of things there, but I really admired my dad. Living on a naval base, you're living in a military life.
yep.
Yeah, I used to run down to the Jarvis Bay Naval Gym, and I got to know the PTE instructors there really well. And
Yeah.
so yeah, perhaps to a large degree, it did indoctrinate me into service of your country or service of the public. And so yeah, I'd agree with your statement overall that yeah, it certainly was. It set me up for the course that I ended up on.
Yeah. We mentioned very early when we started the podcast about trying to attract people to policing, and I see it, and it disappoints me. What's your take on it? Why are we missing people in starting out or seeing policing as a career?
Look, I suppose there's probably hundreds of reasons for that, Gary. I went through an era. I've seen multiple recruiting strategies that have been influenced by government and police policy on recruiting. At one stage, it was based on equitable employment. We need the same number of women joining as we need of men. So when I joined, for example, I think we had about 26 or so in our squad, and we only had 2 women. It was a policy then of only having 2 women in each recruitment. I don't know why they had that policy, but they did. Both of those police officers that got sworn in with me, both women left the job not too long after, and that was a fairly consistent trend.
Yeah.
Also, I think they were quite ostracized too because they'd have children, and then they're put into an intel position, support position.
Makes it harder.
Lots of things impacted on women in policing. Then the policy flipping to equal employment really affected, I guess, recruitment numbers. Then they brought in a policy around you had to have academic qualifications to become a police officer. All of these things, have affected policing over the years.
Yeah.
Even I remember being, we used to have an annual performance review of your unit. And I was at the child abuse and sexual crime group. So the senior management team from the unit come in, and either a deputy commissioner or the commissioner comes in and runs that review. And I remember this particular senior officer, wasn't our commissioner, but a senior officer came in to chair that performance review. And his first comment to us was, well, my first observation is the lack of female senior leadership in this room. And my immediate thought and response was, with all due respect, sir, we are the product of a policy decision from back in the 70s or 80s.
Yeah.
We've lost most of the women who have got 20, 30 years service. So to immediately fix that, put a Band-Aid on it, is going to be very problematic and challenging. So look, that may be a part of it. There's so many diverse career opportunities that are open to people now. I don't know how policing is really perceived by the public. It may not be such a desirable career path anymore for people.
Yeah, I'm worried that's become part of it, and whether COVID played a part in it, that the police were enforcing these laws, the lockdown laws, and all that. So it's not really cool. Having someone standing there checking everyone's got 2 meters between them when they're queuing up.
Yeah, and keeping them locked down in hotels as well. The staff were rotated on basically guarding hotel rooms because it clearly could not be entrusted to a particular agency of security guards that caused some problems up here in Queensland at the time.
Yeah, it doesn't promote it as a career that's very tempting or exciting. But I see someone like the career that you've had, and I wish we could make more use of that type of career. Like you've had a fascinating career, and we're going to delve right into it in a sec. But all the experiences you've got, and that I would imagine you'd look back at your career and think, wow, I made the right choice. And I think if we could get that message across to people, there's so many different paths you can follow in policing, and it is a rewarding career.
It really is. And you're absolutely correct. There's so many different things you can do in your policing career. the different types of work. You know, being a detective isn't for everybody, but you know, forensics, scenes of crime, general duty, like there's just
You
such
rattle them off.
diversity. Yeah, just so much diversity. And ultimately, hopefully you find your niche, you
Yeah.
know, where you feel like you're actually having an effect. I never did rural duty, you know, like I never policed a small town, but I can only imagine how rewarding that would be, you know.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that, John. I look at a good country cop can set the whole standard for the town. And
Totally.
that
Yeah.
must be, yeah, I haven't done that other than, you know, probably like you going out investigations in small country towns. But imagine being, it's almost like the sheriff of the town, keeping the town running smoothly.
A lot of responsibility, lots of challenges. You end up being, you know, you'd have to be very adept, very agile with your politics and your interpersonal skills. Like so many traits come out of people of law enforcement that go and do that work.
Yeah.
I've got the utmost respect for them to be able to do that, you know, because you're never off duty too. You know, you would never be off duty.
No, and your social life is your work's tied up with it. You'd be making a lot of hard decisions, but
Yeah.
also potentially rewarding decisions. So, yeah, I thought just as I was preparing for the podcast, looking at your career and thinking, and it's been troubling me when I hear police are under resourced because they just can't attract people, and I'm thinking why? Like people probably don't appreciate the full scope of what a career can bring to you, a lifetime career. Um, Detectives, why did you go down that path?
So I did a range of duties. Like you know, once I first got sworn in, they expose you to a couple of different experiences. So I walked the beat in the city was my first tour, and then I worked at a local station at Ashgrove Police Station, which doesn't exist anymore. It got burnt down. And then I worked at Brisbane Mobile Patrols, which is 24/7 permanent partner, and only apart from patrolling, going to high priority jobs, which is very exciting work for a young guy. Did that, and at the end of the tour, they then give you a permanent posting, and I was posted back to City Station. I ended up working at the City Watch House for nearly 18 months, which was, I'd have to say, probably. I mean, I worked with some really great people while I was at the Watch House that are still my friends, but I don't know if you ever did that kind of duty, Gary,
No,
but
I tried to avoid it, but
yeah. Like it wouldn't have been my first choice either. But there was a culture in the Watch House that was really good. They were good people. But the problem is, if you're working in the Watch House on a Friday or Saturday night, you are in a fight every Friday and Saturday night. You're dealing with violence. And as a young cop, I was only like 22 or 23. You know, you carry scars from that part of your life.
And this is dealing with the people just brought into custody and processing them. And
correct. Yeah. That's the first place that you go after you've been arrested. And
so they're not happy campers.
In most cases, they're not. You know, they're either drunk, they're on drugs, they're violent. You're having to get people into padded cells. You're having to strip them. There's a huge amount of resistance.
Yeah.
And our job was to process these people and then bail them or hold them overnight and put them through court in the morning. You know, there was suicides in there. There was all sorts of challenges working in that environment that, I'll never forget. And after doing that tour of duty, I was then given a choice of where to work, and I chose Mobile Patrols. I went back there and I ended up becoming a permanent partner with a mate of mine he's actually lives up on the North Coast now as well. He retired recently. And he saved my life. I saved his life. We forged an enormous bond and friendship during that time, just going to code 1, code 2, code 3 jobs consistently. At the end of our time at Mobile Patrols, we both decided we made a lot of arrests. We were very proactive in terms of just taking crooks down. And we both agreed that we thought time to segue into CIB, Criminal Investigation Branch. Both applied at the same time. Both got accepted at the same time. He went to City CIB and I went to Taringa CIB. And that was, once again, a bit of a baptism of fire, working with pretty rough and rowdy regional detective office. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
I do. I smile. It's, you were just thrown in there and the sink or swim.
It was, and being the young PC, well,
Yeah,
yeah, lowest of the bottom feeders.
yeah,
But you cut your bones with some pretty talented, very skilled detectives, and you learn by sitting in on their interviews and what they do and how they socially engineer crooks to make admissions and all that sort of stuff. So that was really interesting. And then I went to the Gap CIB.
it makes a difference just on that point, doesn't it, John? Where and I look back at my career, and sometimes it's you look at these detectives, and they might appear to be flawed characters in some regards, but if they're on a case or in the interview room, they're just on their game, and that's where they came to life. And you couldn't sort of emulate what they were doing, but you take little snippets and you just put it in the memory bank and think, okay, that's a good way of approaching it. And yeah, those role models.
That's a very valuable point, mate, because I don't think there's been a day in my career where I wasn't taking either the really good things that police did or the really bad things that police did and learning from them. Bad things, yeah, park that in the memory bank, never to do that, particularly in leadership roles. We've all worked for bad bosses. It doesn't matter what job you do, you've worked for a bad boss. So you always take that, learn from it, and make sure you never emulate or repeat that behavior with your staff or your team. So yeah, I learned a lot there, and then I went to the Gap CIB, which was a new office, and I worked with great people there as well. That was probably the closest I got to kind of like, a country station. Like, I mean, the Gap's very close to Brisbane City, but it's a it's a very tight community.
Yeah.
I had all sorts of challenges while I was there. My daughter was born. We had a pretty rough gang of local youth that were trying to follow us home. So you were doing, counter surveillance on your way home to make sure you weren't followed.
Yeah.
Some of these crooks were the ones that had burnt down the Ashgrove police station. I had multiple death threats. And I had a young baby at home.
You do feel vulnerable with that. I went through that with my kids, where threats were made, and that a certain character knows where my children go to kindergarten and different things like that. And it's something you feel a little bit vulnerable then, because you're confident that you can protect yourself, but it's when you've got your family to look after, and if they cross that line.
No, it's a fact. I remember on a night duty, we arrested this. I was on night wireless crew, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. work, and basically you're responsible for responding to any criminal investigation, whether the general duties guys call for, across basically North Brisbane.
Yeah.
We end up having to make an arrest of this particular very violent guy who had just knifed two 14-year-old girls. And then you have to go through, the prosecution, the committal, the trial, and everything else, and you're forging a good bond with your victims, and also you're dealing with your crook as well. But after he was sentenced and convicted and sentenced, I remember one day, and this is after I transferred into the child abuse unit, he turned up at headquarters with a knife to kill me. He came up to the top of the stairs.
Yeah.
There would most cops who've done any kind of frontline duty are going to have stories like that of the
people.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
People, 100% people taking it personally, and they just become. And you're not dealing with people that are always making rational decisions. So if their fixation becomes on you, it's
correct.
And it's concerning, because how far do they go? There's a line that generally doesn't get crossed, but it can always be the first time. And
that's exactly right. I mean, and having to carry your weapon home. Like, I mean, I don't know what New South Wales Pol do, but we lock them in the safe back at the office. But I then had to start carrying my weapon home every day. So,
well, I had a marked police car parked out the front of mine for a while, just to dissuade certain threats. So yeah, it's just part and parcel of it, isn't it? Child protection work, that's been your passion, that's been your focus, and you've really made a difference in that field. How did you come to find yourself specialising in that area?
Well, it didn't start by choice. While I was at the Gap CIB, I was throwing in for promotion rounds to detective sergeant in a pool, and I was successful, and they then ring you and tell you where you're going to go to as a detective sergeant, and I was appointed to the child abuse unit. Once again, I guess the psychological challenge for me was that I had a really young child at that stage. Like, she was a baby, and my immediate response I still remember the phone call. I can remember where I was when I got the phone call. It was I can't work there. And the person who made the call was like, "Ah, you'll be right. They've all got kids." I'm like,
Yeah.
now,
Just explain the thinking there, John, because I understand where you're coming from, and I've heard it time and time again from police
yeah.
and the impact. But just explain what you meant by that.
In terms of my response to the
Yeah,
being the child
the
with a
fact that you've
baby,
got a child and they're going to be put into this field, and it's something that no, I don't want to work in that area.
yeah, well, every single day you are dealing with crimes against children, uh, and these children are the same age in many cases as your child.
Mm.
You're seeing the worst things that humanity can do to the most vulnerable citizens on the planet. And then you're going home and you're cuddling your kid a little bit tighter that night.
Yeah.
And I knew that that's what I was going into. And I guess my point is that right now, if I was to ring a successful detective sergeant to say you're coming to the child abuse unit and they reacted like that,
Yep.
I would be going, not a problem. We'll find a place for you. We never recruited into Argos unless you applied to come into Argos.
Yeah.
No, we
Important
never
point.
made people come into that work. And that was perhaps a legacy of what happened to me back in 1996.
Yeah.
So anyway, I went into there, and once again, great people that I had the pleasure of working with. Very, people that had a big impact on my career and the decisions I made. But the nature of the work was really hard. It goes back to what we said at the beginning: emotional, physical, sexual abuse, neglect, all of the horrible things that can happen to the most vulnerable. And you're dealing with them on a case-by-case basis. You're dealing with dysfunctional families, parents who couldn't even agree after a custody split that they could drop the kid off with the other parent. They had to drop the kid at the police station because they couldn't face seeing each other. You just see the worst of humanity. You really do.
You do, don't you? You get dragged right into it in that area of policing. And I think, and this is with children, victims, they're innocent. Like there's no mitigating circumstances if a child's been abused. So you can't. There's nothing that can excuse that. So you're dealing with the darkest of the dark. And I put my hand up with homicide investigations. Sometimes you can see a homicide, not justifying it, but you can say, I understand how that happened or whatever.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with children, there is no excuse. So you are dealing with the worst.
You are. And I think, like I said before too, I just couldn't see any way I am going to have a strategic impact that's going to have long-term effects for the greater population while I'm on this mouse wheel of just seeing all of this trauma. So I started working in the SCAN team, which is the Suspected Child Abuse and Neglect team, and I worked with great people at the Mater Hospital there. So that's a multi-agency approach to dealing with children. So you've got healthcare workers, like from the hospital, Department of Family Services, Education Queensland, and police at the table that are working on cases where children have been taken into care and making informed decisions as a multi-agency approach about the best for that child. So I did that for a while, and then I was offered a diversified position as the first liaison officer down at Queensland Health. So I went and did that for a little while, and I picked up some very, very good skills from the people I worked with there.
Yeah. What was the work that you were doing there?
So the reason they created that position was that there was a lot of people who worked for Queensland Health that were brought into the justice system for a range of reasons, whether it's doctors or malpractice or nurses stealing things or wardsmen, all sorts of different members of employees of Queensland Health ended up in the justice system.
Yeah.
And this can take a very, very long time, as you know. It can take years. Yeah. And lots of them get stood down on full pay, for example, while the investigation is ongoing.
Yep.
So Queensland Health made the decision to bring in a liaison officer to triage, process, keep in touch with the investigators, and keep Queensland Health advised of how those cases were progressing. I kind of got across that pretty quickly, and then just started taking on the investigations myself. So I was actually, as the job came in, I started, if it was in Toowoomba, I'd contact the Toowoomba detectives. I'm coming in, got a search warrant, and they'd come out with me on the job. So I just started doing the work. Towards the end of my time there, I was tapped on the shoulder by Inspector Anne McDonald, who was the inspector at the Child Abuse Unit. to come back and help set up. She wanted to create a team at Argos. Argos was still very focused on historical sexual abuse.
Yep. And just to explain that, and a lot of people would have heard of Argos, but it was a task force that was established. Was it on the back of the recommendations from a inquiry? And
yeah, so it was primarily formed. It was the old child exploitation unit. That team was pulled out and they were put onto the third floor of headquarters initially because of a Bureau of Criminal Intelligence probe on organised pedophilia in the state of Queensland. So they were looking into that. And at the end of that inquiry, the team returned back into the child abuse unit, but the name Taskforce Argos, which is what they were set up as, stayed with them. And so I came into Taskforce Argos about 4.5 years after all of that. The unit had diversified then into more institutional abuse, children that are in care, or placed into Boys Town and things like that, or the Catholic Church or Anglican Church abusing kids, or historical sexual abuse allegations was primarily what they were focused on. But the internet was becoming a thing, like towards the end of the 90s and into early 2000. And Inspector Anne McDonald, she knew I was a little bit of a geek, and I was a bit of a geek. I was building computers, and she wanted me to set up an internet team. And so I was put in the role of setting that up with a team of, I think I had about 3 at that stage.
And this was something. What years are we talking now, John? Because this is the type of innovative stuff that I want to talk about that you've done throughout your career. But this was something really forward thinking on how to approach or prevent proactive policing, stop the crime.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was becoming evident that the technology was being exploited by child sex offenders to communicate. And we were aware of that from investigations that were happening in Europe and the United States, but we didn't, in the Queensland Police Service, we didn't have a response capability for it. I was on the internet back in 1996, 1997. I did my first banned web page in 1997. I was coding HTML. I was building PCs. So
you're an embracer of technology.
Always have been.
Yeah,
I always have been. It really interests me, both as a positive and also as looking at it as a threat.
Yeah.
So it wasn't difficult for me to start looking at the platforms that the offenders are on, and we started proactively. The only real communication platforms at that stage were either email, bulletin boards, internet relay chat, which is IRC, and then MSN Messenger came out very soon after that. But the kids were on IRC, and the child sex offenders were on IRC, and we went online. We set up a controlled operation, which for anybody listening, allows us to do things that are unlawful. I'm just trying to give you a good analogy.
Like buy bus for drugs.
Operation. Undercover cop selling or buying drugs is indemnified by a controlled operation for what they're doing, which would otherwise be a criminal offence.
Yep.
So we had to write our controlled operation, set up all the protocols, all the policies, all of that kind of stuff, buy the technology, look at how we're going to capture evidence. Even capturing evidence was an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So it was all really just breaking the ice. But we were making arrests, so we went online as both child sex offenders and as kids.
And talk us through a case like that so people understand how that would actually play out, the specific case, or just an overview of how that type of investigative technique would play out.
Yeah, so there was kind of 2 strategies in terms of engagement. A lot of it was just monitoring the flow of child abuse material, and then you could capture the IP and execute a search warrant based on that. But when you're engaging, and this is probably where it gets challenging, is socially engineering people. So socially engineering them to believe that you're a child or that you are a child sex offender.
Yep.
Pretending to be a child is quite easy, believe it or not. You've got to do a lot of backstopping and prep and building your persona and all of those kinds of things. But then you just go on as a naive kid and let the child sex offender lead you down a path. Which the other thing too, Gary, there's no legislation at this stage.
Yeah,
right?
New ground.
There was not specific, and this is the thing that I still look back and shake my head. The image or video of a child being sexually abused fell under what was the Classification of Computer Games and Images Act in Queensland, and the state government censor had to issue a certificate saying that that image was unlawful.
It seems
No shit.
ridiculous, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. It does. In 2003, with a really positive police minister, Judy Spence, we managed to get the first criminal code legislation for those images and videos.
And that was the first in the country too, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. It was. So that was put under the criminal code, and we made a point of making sure it was called child exploitation material, not child pornography too, which, other agencies, when they brought their legislation in, call it child pornography, and I have a very strong standpoint on that particular use of terminology.
Talk us through your thoughts there.
Well, calling it kiddie porn and child pornography, just have a think about the use of the word pornography. Pornography, a loose dictionary definition of pornography, is that images or content that by its nature is designed to cause sexual arousal.
Yep.
Right? That's basically what pornography is. So you calling it child pornography,
basically, where you're coming from.
Yeah. It's not child pornography. It's the capture of a moment in time where a child's raped.
Yeah.
It's not child pornography. The only people that can call it child pornography is child sex offenders.
Okay, well, that's when you break it down and explain it, it's strong messaging, isn't it? But,
it is. But, even still in the United States, they call it child pornography in their legislation. Get on the program. We've been arguing about this for 20 years. Call it what it is. Child abuse material, child sexual abuse material, child exploitation, whatever you want to call it, make sure that it's fit for purpose with what's actually happening in that image. And, under every circumstance, if you saw that happening in the real world, you'd be making an arrest and removing that child from harm. But because it's turned into this picture or video, people seem to kind of dismiss it rather than investigating and trying to find that child. And that's probably something that we'll go into in terms of what drove us. So we had no legislation. We had to craft that. We were really at the dawn of it. But in terms of a case, going back to your question, you would create a persona of like a 12 or 13-year-old girl. You get into one of the forums. Your persona would be very clear about who you are, 13-year-old Jane or Julie or whatever else. So your tag is very indicative of who you are. And then you just sit back and watch yourself get hit. I remember on IRC, just ting, 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 like just
frightening how many 30, 40, how many 50 people. Wow.
Yeah. Just, it was insane.
Yeah.
It was just crazy. And of course, like, we had no international networks at that stage. So we were just trying to focus on the best we could jurisdictional cases. Sometimes they went into New South Wales or across into other parts of the country.
Yeah.
You take two tactics with the offender when you were pretending to be a kid. They'd commit a criminal offence where they're grooming you, noting that grooming didn't actually exist as a criminal legislation offence at that point in time as well. A lot of them would masturbate on camera or things like that and then kill the communication. Some of them would want to meet you. So what you would do then is set up a sting where you'd put a young police officer decoy in the field, arrange the time and date. And this happens all the time. New South Wales Pol have been under Richard Long and his team.
Yeah.
I don't think many agencies have done more proactive media as a preventative measure for parents to alert them to the dangers of this than Longy and his team down in New South Wales.
Yeah, I know Richard. I worked with him in homicide, and in passing, when him or his team was going out to take someone down in those areas, I just think it was so very powerful to make people realise this is what can happen and the consequences.
Yeah, and the sex crimes team in New South Wales were very good at keeping that in the public face to make sure that they understood that this is happening. Kids were groomed and were raped. They did turn up to meets. Ultimately, have a look at Carly Ryan, Sonia Ryan's daughter. Like, she met somebody online and ended up getting murdered.
Yeah.
It happens in the real world. So the strategy by New South Wales Pol was very good. And we did the same thing as in Queensland. When we did a sting, you've got footage, you could give it to the media to alert them to the fact that this is happening.
And like some people, and I think this through, and talking about this or other type of investigative techniques, I think the fact that it gets out there, because police are quite often very protective of methodology, But I want these people that are going to prey on children to be suspicious. I want them to maybe have a second thought before they go down that path, because look what can happen. So I didn't mind the fact that it was put out so publicly the way it was, because I thought it sent out a really strong messaging. Would you agree along those lines?
I completely agree. I mean, we have been criticised because of the amount of media and stories and documentaries and things that have been done. We don't give away a great deal of actual covert methodology in that, but I want these people online second guessing all the time. They're paranoid as it is. I'd like to feed that paranoia.
Yeah.
There's a very common saying that you may have heard of, that we're not going to arrest our way out of this with child sex offenders.
Yes.
Because it's a fact. The volume is way beyond what we can possibly ever investigate. You take down a Tor network that's got 45,000 members. Yeah, but we only made like about 80, I think, arrests of those 45,000 because of the way Tor is structured. So your best strategy is disruption, and disruption comes in many forms. One of those is causing fear and paranoia in those communities that they've been infiltrated.
Yeah.
It's very effective.
I agree with it. I think that's a good way of pushing it and making them look over their shoulder. You want them thinking that you're watching them 24/7. How many children over your career have you been involved in the removed from families or harm?
It's not a number that I've actually kept track of, Gary, but I like talking to the victim identification team, which is something we probably need to flesh out.
Yep.
Later on in your interview. It's well into the thousands.
Yeah.
Not just Australia, globally.
Right.
Yeah.
The impact of child sexual assault. There was one of many articles that I've read about the work that you and your team have done, but on a personal one that sort of swung you towards working in that field of child protection. And it got me because it was very powerful in the way it was written, that someone had phoned you to report a crime and couldn't speak for 5 minutes, and then finally started speaking, and he was talking about what happened to him years ago when he was a ward of the state, and how he was treated as a victim when he reported that. Do you recall that particular case?
Yeah, I do. Look, that's one of, I guess, many pivotal moments that we all have in our lives that change our direction or forward. Like, I mean, the abduction and murder of Daniel Morcombe was another moment in time that did that to me as well. But at the time, I was acting senior sergeant, so I was the sergeant in charge of the internet team, but the senior sergeant was away, so I was acting in his role as the overall kind of senior sergeant at Argos. And yeah, I received a phone call. Good morning, Taskforce Argos, Jon Rouse speaking, and there was just nothing at the end, so I wasn't sure if it was a prank call or somebody got the wrong number. But I did hear crying.
Yeah.
Like just sobbing. So I just kind of said, look, just take your time. It's okay, I'm here. Just when you're ready, just I'll wait. And I did. And it took a while, but ultimately this adult male in his 50s recounted his story that he'd been placed in an orphanage that was run by nuns. And on the weekends, as a treat, the groundsman who looked after, the gardener, would take some of the boys to the local drive-in as a treat, where he would sexually abuse them. And after this happened to him, I can't remember if it had happened multiple times or whether it was the first time it happened to him. This is 22 years ago.
Yeah.
Now, he told the nuns, and his words to me were along the lines of, they said, how could you possibly speak so horribly of that good man trying to help you? And he said that they beat his feet till they bled, like caned him on the feet, which was just a horrendous story to listen to this broken human being. And I don't know if I was the first person he'd ever reached out to, but I have been the first person that many historical victims have reached out to, including, one of the residents of when I used to live in an apartment. He came and told me what happened to him when he was young.
Yeah.
I couldn't help him, unfortunately. The same as I couldn't help this guy. Everyone was dead.
Yeah.
You know, I could do nothing at all to try to give that man some peace or justice for what had happened to him. And that really affected me, going, we've just got this wrong. All we're doing is dealing with the carnage that these people inflict on young human beings. We need to be more proactive and on the front foot on this. And so ultimately, over the next 20 years, Argos went from an internet team of 4 to an internet team of well over 30. All of the historical work went out. We went completely proactive. Our performance indicators weren't based on arrests and charges. It was based on how many children we removed from harm. So we flipped our key performance indicators to be where they should be.
Yep.
Yeah.
And isn't that changing the mindset? And it's like, it seems when you talk about it now, it seems so blatantly obvious that's what you should do. But the thinking was, no, we're detectives. When the crime happens, we'll investigate it, and then we'll bring the perpetrator to justice, hopefully. But you've changed the whole thinking of it. That and this is that proactive policing versus reactive policing, and the proactive way of approaching it. When you talk about it now, it seems like a no-brainer. But I know I was around in the era that you're talking about, and it wasn't the way that we looked at crime.
No, it wasn't. Our annual reporting was based on arrests and charges and crime clear-up rates. So it has to be reported for you to clear a crime up.
Yeah.
We were actually we were generating statistics proactively, ultimately, which is fantastic. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Others probably didn't think that was fantastic because we're elevating crime stats. I don't care.
Yeah. I'm laughing because I'm just thinking of the the levels that it goes on in the management level. But well, we don't want to identify that. That looks like I'm not running the command properly, and it's shameful. It really is shameful when
it is in hindsight. And look, I would say too, like, we were fortunate because we were in an area of criminal investigation where we had the luxury of being able to be proactive. Many areas you don't get to do that.
Yes,
you can come up with public awareness, proactive strategies, informing the public about just even securing your belongings and locking your car and things like that. Getting CCTV, lots of things you can come to try to help the public with to stop a crime happening. But we were in an area where we could actually get these predators to target us and take them out, but we could also intercept freshly produced content and images and videos of children that were being abused, and try to find them and stop the abuse.
Well, when we're going to talk about how you did that and the impact that it had on, but just before we end here in part one, I just want to talk about the impact that this type of crime has, not just on the victims, but on society. I've recently I've done a podcast called Predatory with Madeline West, which was quite interesting in the child abuse space, and then another one in prisons. And the amount of prisoners that are in jail that have been victims of childhood sexual abuse, and what that carries with them and how that damages them. If we want to reduce crime, like across the board in all categories, let's have a look at what's happening to the children that we're not protecting. And like the gentleman that phoned you and couldn't speak and could only cry for the first 5 minutes, hanging on to that for so many years. They've destroyed lives. Every time a child is abused, a life is destroyed. And I don't think we fully appreciate the magnitude of the effects of the crime.
No, look, there's a lot of research that's been done by Bravehearts in Australia has done research on this issue. The cost to society of that abuse over years, it goes into millions of dollars. So how about you divert funding in to be more proactive to stop the abuse? While we're being on the topic of proactive, just I guess to wrap up your segment, innovative strategies and this will be a difficult one maybe for some people to listen to, but stopping the hate for a moment hating isn't helping anything here. So right now, if you, Gary, as a young man or a young woman, identify that you have a sexual interest in children, where do you go? What do you do? Who do you tell?
Yeah.
So you don't want to offend, but you can't help yourself because that's the way you have been wired. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's something we've been championing while I was at Argos, and it got national funding and is kind of rolling now as the Stop It Now program into Australia, which actually provides a helpline for child sex offenders.
Look, John, I've had conversations about this, so it's not as foreign as when you first say it. You think, how? And it was someone that I knew professionally through work, talked about a person that approached them and said, look, I've got these fantasies about children. I want to address it. I don't want to cross the line, but my head's clouded with it. Didn't know where to take that. Because they'll get ostracised the moment they put their hand up. But again, if we're talking about preventing, we've got to look at all possibilities of way of preventing. So what you're talking about there, I find it quite fascinating. It's almost like going to Alcoholics Anonymous prior to becoming an alcoholic, preventing it from occurring.
Yeah, like it's once again, I would call it a no-brainer, but there's been a lot of resistance from sectors of the public about this.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm like an advocate for anything that stops a child being hurt. So if one person self-identifies, calls the helpline, gets counselling that diverts them, is that not a good thing for us?
I think it is, John. When you break it down like that, it seems like a no-brainer. What else do you do? Go away, you dirty, rotten pedophile, and then arrest the person after the offence.
Yeah, you're right. It's like many issues that there are in society at the moment. That you need a multifaceted approach to try to tackle the problem. And like I said, I don't like child sex offenders. I dedicated my career to removing them from society, but I can also understand that many of them are wired in a particular way. They're born that way. Just like some people are born into the wrong body, like the wrong sex, and then ultimately go through a sex change to make sure that they do fit. Child sex offenders can't do that.
Yeah.
They stats from one of our operations, about 40% were married men with kids, living a lie.
Complete lie, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's supported by the statistics around it's anywhere over 60, but sometimes over 70% you'll see reported. The actual physical sexual contact offences against children are intrafamilial. It's not the Dennis Ferguson or the stranger down on the corner. It's actually happening within the family: mum, dad, aunt, uncle, brother, sister, cousin, and then it goes out into neighbours or people who have access. It's all about access. Teachers, coaches. It just moves out in concentric circles. But the prime point of contact with children is the family.
Yeah. And that takes away from that stranger danger campaign that
ridiculous,
where the threat was, and the threat was actually under the roof, not outside.
That was a very ill-informed campaign. Perhaps at the time it was seen to be a good thing, but the threat definitely for that first generation contact abuse is all about access, which means family.
Yeah.
The stranger danger threat is real when you come to the internet.
Yep. Breaking it down. Okay. Well, look, let's take a break. And when we get back, we're going to dive deep into what the work that you've done, not just with Argos, but across the board, and it influenced not just in Queensland, but across the country and in fact across the world. And we'll be interested in hearing your story.